Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's third webinar in this three-part series called Borderlands, hosted by the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. My name is Diane Chalfant, and I'm a volunteer and board member of the Yellowstone Gateway Museum here in Livingston, Montana. Our museum is a tremendous resource for our community, and so much of it can be accessed online. Beyond these webinar programs, the Yellowstone Gateway Museum also offers a fascinating digital photo archives, online exhibits, and research services. So if you're not currently a member, we really encourage you to become a member and explore more about the rich natural and cultural heritage of Park County, Montana. In a moment, I'll introduce the museum's curator, Reinhardt, but first I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you'll know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenter, Jon Axline. Your questions will be anonymous. To submit a question, just type your question in the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel, and Karen and I will read the questions and share them with our speaker. And as time allows, Jon will address as many of the questions as he can after the presentation. We will be recording this webinar and we'll upload it to Yellowstone Gateway Museum's YouTube channel after the event. And finally, following the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to take a very short survey, and I hope you'll do that because we like to use the survey results to help us to continue to improve this webinar series and other programs at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. I'd now like to introduce Yellowstone Gateway Museum's curator, Reinhardt. Karen?
Thank you, Diane, and thank you for all of your help. I invite all of you to watch your local newspaper and social media sites for future programming offered by the museum, as this is the last program in this series. But for now, I will just introduce tonight's speaker, Jon Axline. Jon Axline is a longtime historian and interpretive marker coordinator at the Montana Department of Transportation. He's a fourth-generation Montanan, and he graduated from Montana State University with an MA in American History. Jon also has published a number of articles and books on a variety of Montana history subjects, ranging from dinosaur raptors to the Cold War sky watchers. He lives in Helena with his wife, Lisa, 3 corgis, and a spoiled dachshund. Now, please sit back, relax, and enjoy hearing about the construction of the Beartooth Highway, one of Montana's most spectacular crown jewels. Please welcome Jon Axline.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Well, I'm in Helena, and I'm glad to be there with you guys as well. I got to warn you at first, this is my first Zoom presentation, and probably something's going to happen during it that I'm not expecting, but we'll muddle through it and hope for the best. Usually when I do this program with the live audience, I ask everybody, how many of you have actually driven the Beartooth Highway, and I'm assuming tonight that most of you have done that. And so we're all used to the spectacular views from the highway into the Beartooth Mountains and down in the valley there towards Red Lodge. But we also, have probably shared a few white knuckle moments going around the switchbacks, especially when we're heading down the highway. And but mostly what I've been interested in is what it took to build that highway. It was built at a time when the United States and especially Montana was going through a particularly nasty economic depression. The highway was a big part of Montana's dealing with that particular crisis. It was also something that was on the surface of it designed to help people get into Yellowstone National Park by providing a scenic route into the park. But there was more to it than just that. And what I've learned over the years is there was an awful lot of people that worked on that highway. What I didn't know at the time when I met most of them was what part of the highway did you work on? Because I think that means that makes quite a bit of difference, as you'll hear later on tonight. As we all know, the Beartooth Highway has been called America's most beautiful drive by CBS correspondent Charles Corral. But there's also been some other quotes about it that I think are just as good. There's also a lot, all this is praise as to what this highway really represents, and none of which does really justice to the highway itself. It's been called the country's highest and most novel highway. Montana Congressman and later Governor Roy Ayers wrote in September 1934, 2 years before the highway was completed, quote, "It seems to me the location is perfectly chosen to reveal the greatest scenic treats imaginable, and that the engineering accomplishment represented in that stretch of highway reflects the highest possible credit upon the engineering genius of the United States." A man named F.A. Kittredge, who worked for the Bureau of Public Roads, which was nominally in charge of the project in the 1930s, wrote, it is a most wonderful highway, and the scenery is such that the highway can hardly help but rank as one of the most spectacular and interesting in the country." So that's just, skimming the top of things that have been said about the highway over the years. But, to me, again, the history of the route is really the most interesting of it, how it was built, who built it, and why it was built. And of course, I like the scenery from the top as well. Let's see how we can, there we go. Okay, well, we'll stick with that one for a minute. Most of you may not know that the highway follows in some places ancient Native American trails that had been around for thousands of years, that there was quite a presence of Native Americans on the Beartooth Plateau going back thousands of years. And we're just now getting a better idea of what that presence was as the glaciers retreat and more sites are being uncovered at the higher elevations. Also, most likely, lone fur trappers probably crossed over a lot of this area where the highway is today, as well as prospectors looking for gold in the gold-rich Beartooth Mountains, and looking for silver and other minerals as well. In 1881, General Phil Sheridan did lead an expedition consisting of 120 men across the Beartooth Plateau to the new mining camp of Cooke City. We do know that part of the route that he followed across the plateau follows pretty much the Wyoming side of the Beartooth Highway today. That was really the best route over the top at that time. But it's really not until the 1910s that we start to see some real movement towards building some kind of an automobile route over the mountain, something a little bit more permanent than a trail. This particular fellow is a Red Lodge physician named Dr. J.C.F. Siegfried. He was a type A personality, most definitely. He was a member of all the different civic clubs in Red Lodge. Wherever, I keep thinking of that old quote about Teddy Roosevelt, that when Roosevelt was at a funeral, he wanted to be the corpse, and when he was at a wedding, he wanted to be the bride. So Siegfried was a lot like that. He was a tremendous booster of Carbon County and the Red Lodge in particular. At one point, they found a tooth in one of the mines in the Bear Creek district, just over the divide from Red Lodge, and he made a big deal about that being a human tooth, and that the Beartooth Plateau and the valleys around it were really the cradle of mankind in North America. Even after the tooth was proven to belong to an herbivore, that didn't stop him from promoting that particular idea. But it was really Siegfried that came up with the idea of an automobile route trail across the Beartooth Plateau, and to that end, he was lobbying the Montana State Highway Commission pretty hard, the National Park Service, anybody who would listen to him. Siegfried would try and get them to plant the seed of the idea for that particular highway. He saw the highway as really a boon to Red Lodge. The coal industry was starting to decline in the 1920s, and eventually the coal mines in Red Lodge would close during that decade. So we really saw the highway over the top as an alternative to well, really as a lifesaver for Red Lodge and much of Carbon County, as a way to promote tourism, recreation, and other activities that would draw people to the Red Lodge area and keep the town alive. He was successful enough, let's see if I have another photo of him. He was successful enough in 1919 that he was able to get the Montana State Highway Commission to award a contract to construct a highway over the top of the Beartooth Plateau. And many of you may know about this particular highway. It was part of what they called the Black and White Trail, which in those days, highways didn't have numbers, they had names. And they were blazed by different types of signage so people would be sure they were on the right track. And the Black and White Trail initially went between Bear Creek and over the top of Mount Maurice to Cooke City. Later on, that route would be expanded from Billings to Cody. But initially, the Highway Commission had just gotten money from the federal government under the first Federal Aid Road Act in 1916. They had money to spend, and the contract to build a highway over the top was the first federally funded project that the Highway Commission awarded to a contractor. And so it has some significance in that respect. I can't recall how much they paid, how much the federal share of the project was, but anyway, there was enough interest in it to generate that particular thing to happen. The resident engineer was employed by the Highway Commission was a man named Red Thatcher. That's him sitting in the tent here with his with his surveyor's transit there right next to him. And he was in charge of surveying the route up the side of Mount Maurice and up to the Beartooth Plateau. So really the Black and White Trail began in Bear Creek. At one point it would be switched to Red Lodge, but initially when this project was let, it was Bear Creek was the Montana terminus of what they hoped would be a highway over the Beartooth Plateau. The men worked hard, but not really hard. As you can see, they took advantage of Rock Creek and other fishing streams in the Beartooth during the time they were at work. This is really, I don't know who any of these men were. The records about this particular project are really sparse. They don't really go into much detail about what exactly it was they did. But we do know that they did build part of the highway. They went up the side of Mount Maurice. This is what it looked like in 1920. I imagine, now after the fires this last summer, that you might be able to see this route again. It was pointed out to me. My wife is from Bear Creek, and so one of her brothers pointed it out to me at one point, but I really couldn't see it. But they've been up, the trail still exists. It's just kind of overgrown with vegetation now. There are 13 switchbacks that go up the side of Mount Maurice. The funding ran out, unfortunately, after 1921, after the passage of another federal highway bill. And so it was never completed, and all work had stopped on this particular road by 1924. After the feds kind of got out of it, some of the citizens in Carbon County tried to keep the project going. The reason why the federal government got out of it, why Montana got out of this particular project, was because they were really promoting highways that connected with each other. And really, once they got to the top of the Beartooth Plateau with this, there was nothing planned for anything beyond that. And so this road was really a road to nowhere. And so that's why the federal funding of it stopped at that time. But that wasn't the end of the project. Through most of the 1920s, there was active lobbying in Congress for the construction of the road on a entirely different alignment than the Black and White Trail. But this time, the work was really being promoted by the publisher and editor of the Carbon County News, a fellow by the name of O.H.P. Shelley, or Oscar H.P. Shelley. He was, again, just like Siegfried, he was a type A personality. He was very pushy. He wasn't a particularly pleasant person to be around. especially when he got a bee in his bonnet and he had a goal in mind to get something done. But what's important about Shelley is that he had the connections in Congress to actually get something going with the federal government in regards to building a highway connecting Red Lodge with Cooke City and Yellowstone National Park. There was quite a bit of support for this route by the park as well. The reason being is they wanted to get the mining trucks off the highways in Yellowstone Park. And at that time, if they were still mining in the Cooke City area and the mining trucks had to drive the road over to Gardner to get out of that area, and they were really beating the heck out of the roads there in the park. And it would become kind of a danger to the tourists that were visiting the park as well. So what the Park Service was particularly interested in was building another way for those trucks to maybe not go through the park, but to go over the top of the hill into Red Lodge to get out of that particular area. So Shelley was pushing it hard. He managed to get the support of Montana's congressional delegation, one of which was Senator Thomas Walsh, who did pull a lot of weight in Washington, D.C., and also with Montana's congressional delegate by the name of Scott Levitt. And so here's Levitt's the man in the middle of this photograph. This is up in Marias Pass when that highway was completed about 1930. And this was the obelisk that sat in the middle of US Highway 2 at that time. But Levitt was a big promoter of the Beartooth Highway as well, as was the other Montana Senator, Burton K. Wheeler, who he did carry a lot of weight in Congress at that time. All right. So finally, things came together in January 1931 when President Herbert Hoover signed the National Parks Approach Act into law. And it allocated $3 million for the construction of scenic routes in 3 national parks, including Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Sequoia. But what it really appears is that this legislation was pretty much the baby of the Montana congressional delegation. And it sounds to me, from what I've read and what I've seen in other places, is that the National Parks Approach Act was really intended to build the Beartooth Highway, that there was really no other plan to build highways in those other 2 national parks under that legislation. And indeed, most of the money that was allocated, the $3 million, was spent on the Beartooth Highway. So there really wasn't any other money to do that. So the man that's standing with Hoover here on the left, that's Horace Albright. He was the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park and a big supporter of the Beartooth Highway project as well. And he would later go on to be the man in charge of the National Park Service. So, but with the National Parks Approach Act, the mileage was limited to 60 miles, all of which had to be included within a national forest. So to get the road to connect with the federal aid highway in Red Lodge, where the road ended, the highway ended, they had to come up with a different funding scheme to build that. I don't remember how long that particular route was. I guess. So to do that, they had to withdraw 8 miles from Montana's federal aid system and attach it to the highway south of Red Lodge to be able to do that. I suppose I should be going to say something. The Federal Aid Road Act in 1921 created what they called the 7% system. And what that system did was that every 7% of the total road mileage in each state was eligible for federal aid funding if they were going to do road improvements. So if you wanted to add a road to it, you had to take another road off of it and add the new one off. So in this case, the road that was dropped so that they could add the connector between Red Lodge and the Beartooth Highway was the old highway between Red Lodge and Bear Creek to the east of the town there, which was just about 8 miles. And so that would be funded a little bit differently. It wouldn't be funded under the National Parks Approach Act. But so it all came together rather quickly. Everybody, it was largely, well, I won't say largely, it was a bipartisan. There was a lot of bipartisan support for it. There were a few senators that didn't really support it. They thought that that Montana was and Wyoming were really going to be getting all the benefits of this and the other states wouldn't. But I think that was really the intent from mostly in the beginning anyway. All right. Now, the way it would work would be, it's in a national forest, so the Montana Highway Department isn't involved in this project at all. So who is involved is the Bureau of Public Roads, that they were tasked with building highways within national parks and national forests on Indian reservations and across other federal public lands. So the money would come basically out, or some of the money would come basically out of Montana's federal aid allocation, but most of that would not. But the Highway Department wasn't involved in this project at all. It was all the Bureau of Public Roads. And so, not that that's really going to make much difference in the long run, but it will make a difference. I'll talk about that as well. So the survey of the new route began in 1930. Two gentlemen on the left were working on the survey of the Beartooth Highway. Man holding on the left of that photograph wearing the knickers, is that what they call them? I guess, I'm not sure. Is a man by the last name of Mitchell, Harry Mitchell, and he was the chief surveyor on this particular project and also would be the chief engineer when they actually started building the route. And then the photograph on the right just shows the survey crew that was set in the center line for the highway as it climbed up to the plateau and eventually on both sides of the Beartooth Plateau. I've searched for the plans. I understand there are plans for this particular highway, but they're about as basic as you're going to find anywhere. Mostly what they show is a center line. And they show you where the areas will need cuts, areas that will need fill, but they're nothing like the highway plans that you see today. They're really what characterized this project was seat of the pants engineering, because you really couldn't anticipate a lot of the projects or the problems you would have on this particular project, because it was really kind of a new thing for the Bureau and for the contractors who would eventually be involved in it. Project was divided into 4 segments. Segment A would be the 12 miles from the national forest boundary south of Red Lodge to the top of the Beartooth Plateau on the Montana side of the border. Section B was 25 miles in length. It went from the Montana border east of Red Lodge through Wyoming to connect with the Section A at the top of the plateau. Both A and B would consist of most of the work on this particular project. Section C went from the Yellowstone National Park boundary through Cooke City to connect with Sections B, and then the last segment, Section D, would be the one that went from Red Lodge south to the National Forest boundary. That Section D wasn't included in the National Parks Approach Act funding. So on June 26th, 1931, segments A and B were let to contract. The Morrison Knudsen company out of Idaho won the contract for the Montana side. The side where all the switchbacks are was built by Morrison Knudsen. The side on the Wyoming side, Section B, the contract went to a company called McNutt and Pyle out of Oregon. Now, this is going to be the fun part of this whole project. Is McNutt and Pyle were significantly underqualified to work on this particular project. And I believe the reason for that probably is because of the Great Depression, that a lot of companies, it's been my experience, were bidding on projects that they weren't qualified to get because they needed the money. And because McNutt and Pyle submitted the lowest bid, which was $40,000, and they severely underbid this particular project, that they're the ones that got the project. And they had very limited experience building roads. And the roads they did build were in Oregon. They hadn't ever worked in Montana or Wyoming. If you hear the dogs barking in the background, I apologize for that. My wife just got home from the grocery store. All right. So Anyway, this is where it gets, okay, here's Harry Mitchell. He's the Bureau of Public Roads engineer in charge of the project. He's the man on the left. And there's OHP Shelley, the publisher of the Montana or the Carbon County News on the right. Now, Shelley is going to be intimately involved in this project, primarily on the Montana side. And so we'll be hearing quite a bit more about him. All right, so Morrison Knudsen got the project for segment A. This is going to be the segment building all those fun switchbacks on the Montana side. And so they were fortunate. They were a highly organized contracting company. They had just gotten off of building another project here in Montana, I believe. And so they were able to ship their equipment to Red Lodge on the railroad, where it was disembarked, and then they just drove that equipment down to the beginning of the project at the base of the mountains. So they didn't have very far to go with this particular project, but as you can see, this was quite a spectator sport, watching the steam shovels come off of the shovels coming off of the flat cars in Red Lodge. This is a photo of the first shovel full of dirt overturned for the Beartooth Highway. You can see Shelley is standing there in front of the cab of the third man from the right. But it was a big deal to the people of Red Lodge. A lot of people from Red Lodge were hired to work on the construction crew, and which was really fortunate because, again, the Red Lodge mines had shut down several years before. The community was economically depressed, and this was an opportunity to put a lot of these men back to work. Again, Morrison Knudsen was highly organized. They were referred to as a well-oiled machine by Mitchell in his correspondence to Washington, D.C. about this particular project. This is the Morrison Knudsen construction camp. It's about where the MK campground on the just south of Red Lodge is located today. As you can see, they have well-built cabins. They had families there, single men barracks for single men. There was also a mess hall, recreation hall, and other facilities for the men as they worked on this particular project. And as far as I know, the cabins were tight enough that they could live there year round, and even when construction activities had ceased. And just a quick photograph of beginning work. They had two steam shovels, or two shovels initially. One led the other. It was called the Pioneer shovel, and it did the basic groundwork, establishing where the center line of the road would go, while the shovel following it would clear a better path so that the shovel, the bulldozers, and the pick and shovel men could get in and really build the highway. It's kind of an interesting process, as you can see. If you see up above there towards the just a little bit right of the photograph, there is a shovel that's emptying into a dump truck. The way that it worked was that the trucks would come head on into the shovels, or sideways like this one, and the dirt would be dumped into the back of it, and then they would turn around, or else they would back up, and then, like the truck there on the left there, would just dump it over the side. There were a few instances where the dump truck drivers backed up a little bit too far and went over the edge, but Morrison Knudsen was safe enough with its employees that nobody was killed during that process. But I imagine it was a little bit hairy at times, especially as they got further up the side of the mountain. And here's a photograph showing, about what they did. So, as you can see, you had to be paying attention to what you were doing. And Morrison Knudsen was very good at instilling that safety ethic in its people. There's another photo of one of the shovels and dump truck a little bit further on in the process, where they've actually established the route. And then again, another photo of showing them doing a lot of photographs showing the shovels dumping dirt into the back of the dump trucks. And then the men resting on top of the mountain. And All these men were hired pretty much through from the Red Lodge area, from Carbon County. Most of them are going to be from Montana. They're hired under the terms of the National Reemployment Act, which specified that you had to hire the bulk of your construction crew from the local area. And only the management, the supervisors, or the foreman, and a few others could actually be from out of state. And really, the Beartooth Highway project was no different from any of those other highway projects going on in Montana at the same time. It was just a little bit more, I think, interesting in the long run. Of course, as it got later into the year, or even early in the construction, as this photograph shows, it would snow, and then it really becomes pick and shovel work to clean off that highway so construction could continue. I think it's also important to note that you had the pioneer shovel, you had the backup shovel, you did have some bulldozers really grading the road, but there's an awful lot of this road that's being built by men just wielding picks and shovels. And that's the whole idea between the Reemployment Act, was to put as many men to get to work as you possibly could, and to minimize the amount of machinery, power machinery, to make sure you hired as many people as you possibly could. There were also public meetings on a regular basis where they would have music, and there'd be updates on how the project was proceeding. The man standing there in the suit on the left, that's Dr. Siegfried. He was, again, like he was with the Black and White Trail, he was intimately involved with this particular project as well. But for the most part, Shelley had iced him out of the whole project. He really wasn't a factor in this one like he was with the other highway. Things were a little bit different on the Wyoming side of the border. Like I said, McNutt and Pyle were really not prepared to deal with this project. I think they really had no concept of what was going to be expected of them. They didn't have the same advantages as Morrison Knudsen, specifically in their organization. To get the heavy equipment to the work site, they had to unload it in Gardner, and then they drove it across the northern part of the Yellowstone National Park to the construction site. So this shovel you see here in the foreground, that was, they didn't have the opportunity to haul it very close to the construction area. They had to drive it some 60 to 80 miles, I believe it was, to where the first construction camp was. Problem with that was a lot of that equipment broke down along the way. McNutt and Pyle didn't really plan this project very well. So instead of having well-built cabins for its construction crew, most of these people and their families lived in tents, the different construction camps along the length of that particular project. So very primitive living conditions. The food wasn't very good. It seemed like reading the reports that the Bureau of Public Roads sent to Washington, D.C., that really McNutt and Pyle were in way over their heads, and would make promises to get to a certain point and then not really ever being able to meet any of those deadlines that was set for them by the Bureau. So this is going to be a lot of fun when it gets to be wintertime or when it snows, because you really can't keep people living in tents, especially families. And so unlike Morrison Knudsen, there was a pretty high turnover of employees for McNutt and Pyle during the construction of the road. In fact, one of the Bureau of Public Roads reports wrote about McNutt and Pyle, says, poor superintending, poor and improper handling of equipment, inexperienced shovel operators, poor shop accommodations, insufficient air equipment, poor dumpsmen in the fills, and the lack of coordination between the dumpmen and the shovel operators. The stressing of the superintendent of high production in the individual units without regard to the coordination of these particular units. So at one point, they actually set fire to one of their repair tents because they didn't properly drain the oil out of a truck that had broken down. And it was just, basically it was a mess. So while Morrison Knudsen is making good time on the Montana side, building those switchbacks up the side of the mountain, that McNutt pile were really just creeping along in their work, and weren't meeting any of the deadlines set for them. So, and also McNutt Pile, unlike Morrison Knudsen, relied a lot on transient workers, and so, or GIPOs they called them, and people who really didn't have the proper experience with a lot of the equipment that they were operating. There was also quite a long supply line for them, stretched from Gardner 80 miles to the base of the mountain. One of them wrote that it was a proving ground for trucks. The trucks were loaded as long as anything would stay in, and regardless of weight, and run until they either broke down, burned up, or ran into each other or into trees. So there's really, it really was a mess on the Wyoming side of this particular project. This is a photo of one of McNutt Pile's bulldozers clearing a route. Must have been late spring, early fall. Again, another one. We don't have as many photographs of their operation as we do of Morrison Knudsen's. Here we are again. It just doesn't really show the same coordinated activity as Morrison Knudsen had. But another company came in and they built the bridges on the Wyoming side. There really aren't any on the Montana side. And part of the National Park Service's mission at that time was to build these bridges to look as rustic as possible. In actuality, they're steel stringer bridges, but they're dressed up to look like they're log bridges, like these two here. So they look very rustic, and they really fit in with the overall environment and association with Yellowstone National Park. But McNutt Pile didn't build the bridges. It was a different contractor altogether. Eventually, the road did kind of come together. This is on the Cooke City side, and they did do, actually, what happened was that other contractors had to come in and fix up what McNutt Pile had started, and so that really slowed down the construction of this project as well. Most of the road had a road mix oil surface, a really primitive pile or oil surfacing. Excuse me. This is paving the road through Cooke City. This is how Montana's roads were paved during the 1930s. It's really a low-grade oil that's mixed with gravel, and some of you might remember those old playgrounds that we played on that had asphalt surfacing. That's a lot of what that asphalt was like. It wasn't very durable, and it had to be resurfaced and quite often, especially in weather like this. Okay, there we go. But Morrison Knudsen did finish their side on time. They were able to work through the winter of 1931, 1932, and they finished their part of the project to the top of the Beartooth Plateau in October of 1932. The paving came a little bit later, and this photograph is a little bit later as well, because initially the Beartooth Highway had no guardrails. So as you can imagine, that'd be a little bit disconcerting for tourists on the road. They also didn't have any striping on it. And so drivers had a tendency to steer away from the edge of the road. So sometimes that put them on a head-on collision course for cars coming up from the other side. This probably was the most romantic of all the segments. And really, this is the part of the Beartooth Highway that gets the most press, is the side with the Montana side of the highway. The curves all had names that were given to them by the workmen. Not really sure which one this is. One of them was called Dead Man's Curve. There's another one called the May West Curve. And so it was, I think in some regards of what I heard from people who worked on it, there was, a lot of camaraderie on this particular project, and you really don't hear a lot of the negative aspects about the construction of the Montana side of Beartooth Highway. It was widened in 1933. It had been a lot narrower, but it was widened, and then eventually it would be paved in 1934 and 1935. And the Wyoming side would be completely paved in 1936. But I do like the idea there weren't any guardrails on that, because I can imagine the feeling that a lot of those people must have had driving too close to the edge of the road. That wasn't until June 14th, 1936 that the Beartooth Highway officially opened. But before that, people were using the route, and you could drive all the way through it. And on specific days, Morrison, Knudsen, and McNutt-Pyle would open the road to motorists, even though it hadn't been completed yet. The part that it was kind of not really great was at the top, before the road was really mapped out and set, that people were driving through the boulder fields up there, and I guess it played hell with the cars as they went over the top. But there was a lot of public interest in this project as it was going on, especially from the people of Red Lodge and Billings. And so, even though it didn't officially open till June of 1936, that people had been traveling it since as early as 1932. There was only 2 fatalities in the construction of the highway. One was a premature explosion on segment B with the McNutt-Pyle segment. I haven't really been able to find too many details about that, other than the fact that it was to have been a dynamite explosion that went off. Well, yeah, I do know a little bit more about it. I'm sorry. I'm recollecting a lot of this as I go along, that they did have to use dynamite on to clear a path on top of the plateau. And in this particular case, the dynamite went off prematurely and killed one of the McNutt-Pyle workers. The other segment, the other fatality was on segment D. This is this part from Red Lodge to the national park or the national forest boundary, and a Red Lodge man fell into the road oil mixer machine and was killed. So, and I can't really imagine anything worse than what would happen to that particular man after seeing what that equipment looked like. Even before it was finished, there was quite a bit of debate about different names for the road. One group wanted to call it the Red Lodge Cooke City Highway, which was really the name that it went by for most of the 1930s and into the 1940s. Others wanted to call it the Cooke City Highway. Another group of school children in Billings, one of them came up with the name Highway to the Clouds, and another one Highway to Heaven. So, but eventually they settled on the Red Lodge Cooke City Highway, and then eventually it would be known as the Beartooth Highway by the post-war period. It was an instant success, and mostly because of the national and international press about it. It became a destination for vacationers within just a short time, and both Yellowstone Park and Red Lodge entrepreneurs ran bus tours up the mountain for tourists. And as you well know, that there is an outfit in Red Lodge that is running those bus tours even today, in the yellow buses like what was used originally. Okay, here's another view of Dead Man Curve and a colorized postcard of that particular photograph. This one looks particularly daunting on the left, and on the other one is the May West curve. I think the meaning of that particular curve is probably lost on people today who have really no knowledge of May West and why that curve like that was felt to represent her physical attributes in the 1930s. Another view taken by a Red Lodge, or excuse me, a St. Paul, Minnesota photographer, showing the Montana side with the switchbacks, I think you really get a good sense of how steep that route was up the side of the hill, and how that road really clings to the side of the mountain like it does. This is one of the, I believe this is one of the Red Lodge tour buses at that time. And there was two different types of buses used, one by the park and then one by Red Lodge. But as you can see, this is a little bit later on where they've got their log guardrails, and when most of the snow is cleared. And this is on the Wyoming side with one of the Yellowstone Park buses, and one of those rustic bridges that the Park Service and the Bureau of Public Roads specified on this project. Views were stunning. I mean, as much has been made about the what you can see from the route, but again, I think a lot of the times you have a tendency to forget the effort that went into actually building the road. This is, I believe, the Yellowstone Park buses. They would take them up there even before the route had been completely plowed off. Now that brings up another question that became an issue as early as 1931. Is who's going to take care of this route? And this is still an issue in regards to the Beartooth Highway, is that there was a lot of debate about who was going to be responsible for maintaining it. And initially it was the Bureau of Public Roads, but they took on that responsibility reluctantly. There was an awful lot of cleanup work that needed to be done in the years, after the road was built, as far as cleaning off landslides and that type of thing that had blocked the route. But who's going to be responsible for clearing the snow every year? So again, the Bureau of Public Roads did it until 1939. But most people thought that somehow Montana should be responsible for that, and Wyoming, and both states were reluctant to take on that task, as you can imagine. And so eventually the National Park Service would take that over and clear the route every year, and until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, the Montana Highway Department assumed responsibility for the maintenance of the road on the Montana side of the border. So that's when the Highway Department got involved in doing the plow work and the maintenance work. And now, of course, it's the Montana Department of Transportation that does it. But it's continued on as a National Park Service responsibility on the Wyoming side. And every few years, at least during my career at MDT since the 1990s, is the subject comes up is, should we really be taking care of this road? And Wyoming has steadfastly refused to have anything to really do with the Beartooth Highway. But we still take our responsibilities for it seriously, and we've done, again, quite a bit of repair work to the road over the years as well. Another view, I think taken from the same vantage point pretty much as the one with the two women we just saw a minute ago. This has been another interesting thing about the Beartooth Highway, was the Top of the World store on the top of the Beartooth Plateau that opened for a few days every summer. And at least initially, what they did was they just tried to get motorists to stop there, and they would sell the men alcohol. And so you could buy beer up there and harder drinks if you wanted, and not real hard liquor, but hard enough. And of course, there was soft drinks and other things for women and children as well. But I always thought it was interesting. It's really, something that you wouldn't see today. So you can see in the sign behind the buffet there that they were selling Budweiser and Pepsi and 7-Up to the tourists who stopped there. A lot of them times the men would just stand. These were all men who worked at the Top of the World buffet, were businessmen from Red Lodge that volunteered their time to do this every year. And I've heard an awful lot over the years of people who remember this quite fondly, but eventually they did stop selling alcohol at the Top of the World. There is another view. These were all members of the Red Lodge Chamber of Commerce, and this was a big promotional thing for them every year. But The completion of the route was a real boon for Red Lodge and for Cooke City. Red Lodge, again, you know, the coal mines, the very reason for its existence, got shut down in the 1920s. Pretty much the Bear Creek mines were done with by the end of the 1940s. But with the opening of the Beartooth Highway, that gave Red Lodge really an access point to the Yellowstone National Park. So the town really transformed itself over the years from really a coal mining town, really a coal mining camp, into really a tourist town. And so along with that was a big change in the businesses that were located along Main Street. There's a whole new optimism in the community about the completion of the Beartooth Highway, not just because of the access to Yellowstone National Park, but also it gave people access to the recreational opportunities in the Beartooth Mountains as well. And so it was really a big deal for Red Lodge and also for Cooke City as well, that really, you know, they were a mining camp just like Red Lodge was, and they really blossomed into more of a tourist community in the 1930s because of the completion of the road. So it has some significance to it outside of just the construction part of it, the engineering part. And so it's, you know, my experience with Red Lodge has been when I've been down there and there's been a lot of snowfall over the years, that the business owners in Red Lodge tend to get a little bit edgy at the end of by Memorial Day if the highway isn't open, because a lot of their economy is based on the opening of that road at about on Memorial Day weekend. One thing that I enjoyed quite a bit that began in the 1940s was the See 'em Alive Zoo. It was definitely a tourist stop for people on the Beartooth Highway. This building is still there. I'm not sure what it's used for now, but I remember spending an awful lot of hours in the See 'em Alive Zoo when I was a kid and really enjoying it, and was sorry to see it when it finally closed down. Also a lot of motels. Instead of tourist cabins, tourist camps, in the 1930s, you start to see the rise of the little motel units like this one. On the top thing, the Crosser Super Service is the gas station there that was, and the motel was associated with it. Some of those buildings still exist. Below that there for the other one, Harley's, this place still exists as well, although it's not open anymore. This is the old Eagle's Nest motel where, believe it or not, my wife and I stayed at that quite a bit when we were early in our marriage because it was affordable. And if you didn't like water pressure, that was really a good place to stay. But it looks, you know, significantly different now as well. Just another postcard view of the Beartooth Highway. This is taken from a photograph, just to give you a sense of what it looked like climbing up to the top of the plateau. And then finally, now even the Northern Pacific Railway used the Beartooth Highway in its tourist promotion programs beginning in the 1930s. And this is a shot of very, you know, cowboy and his horse overlooking the highway. This as well, very, very Montana-ish. They're very Western, I should say, which was one of the appeals of the road that the promoters really tried to push as well. So the route stays a maintenance headache. There's a lot of work that occurs on it every year because of the snowfall. Plowing is a big deal that starts about first part of May and continues until Memorial Day. And afterwards, usually the road closes about end of September, middle to the end of September because of snow. We've had some pretty significant projects to repair the route on the Beartooth here over the past few years. So it's not an easy highway to maintain, but it's very dear to a lot of people. And I think once you drove the Beartooth Highway, one time on the Beartooth Highway, you'll never forget that particular experience. The highway was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 2014. And unfortunately, we haven't done a whole lot of interpretive work on the highway yet. A little bit at the Vista Point which was a staging area originally and then became a kind of a tourist scenic area, scenic overlook later on. So with that, that's about all I've got about the construction of the Beartooth Highway. It's a big deal, and one where I kind of, unlike the going to the Sun Road, you don't hear about the construction of this one quite as much as you do about the going to the Sun Road, but it's important nonetheless, not only to Montana and Yellowstone National Park, but to Wyoming as well. So with that, I'm open for questions.
Great presentation, John. That was fascinating, and the images and the stories are just nostalgic and great. We had several comments and questions, and I just want to remind the people who provided comments that we keep it anonymous, but John will be able to read the comments directly as well. So we'll start out with someone offered right at the beginning that their grandfather helped build this and their grandmother was a camp cook.
Oh yeah.
Pretty neat.
I think I know who that is.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing over the years, the number of people that I've heard about that that worked on this route. And unfortunately, I mean, in the earlier in the 1990s, Carbon County Historical Society had kind of initiated an oral history program for trying to track down people who had actually worked on this road. And but since then, I think a lot of those people have passed away, and we don't have that firsthand reminiscing about the construction of the road anymore.
And that actually was another comment. Someone had asked about oral histories collected and from people who had worked on the highway, and did you come across any in your research? And this person also said, in case it encourages you to never retire, the laugh line, May West Curve, gave this person an immediate chuckle. So there are people whose memory goes back.
I look at that curve and, I know who May West was. I don't really see it, but I understand how it got its name. Anyway, I think I'm not sure how far they got into the historical society down there, got into actually taking oral histories. I think they tracked down the names of a lot of the men who worked on it. And, but I don't recall them sitting down with many men and really asking them about their experiences building the road. The only one that I really knew much about was Warren McGee out of Livingston, who I know you guys have all heard of Warren, and he worked on it for a short time when he was a teenager, and he told me that I think he worked for the camp cook. That's what he was telling me, but he spent all of his time with his camera taking photographs, and so they fired him.
Oh.
And so he didn't work for him very long. But I don't know if those photographs he took made it to the Montana Historical Society when his collection was donated to it before his death, and something to look into, I think, a little bit more.
John, we'll check that out because we have Warren McGee's photographs, his research photographs of Montana, Yellowstone National Park and areas surrounding it. So it might be that we even have them at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. So I'll have to check into that.
Well. Yeah, boy, Warren was a character.
Yes, he certainly was. We do have another comment, and this is regarding that you mentioned in the 1930s, there was a big push to build a road connecting Cooke City to Red Lodge to get the mining trucks off the roads going through the park. So this person is wondering, did the road connecting Cooke to Cody exist then, or was there only one way in and out of Cooke City?
There was one way in and out of Cooke City at that time. So once the snow closed the park, that you were stuck in Cooke City until you could get through.
Okay.
And so,
do you know?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, do you know when highway, I think is it 296? When the Chief Joseph Scenic Highway was built?
It's one of those things that I remember seeing the date and I just don't remember what it is.
Okay.
I want to say it wasn't until the 1960s.
Okay.
But I could be very well be wrong about that. But so yeah, the mining trucks were carrying that ore from Cooke City to Gardner.
Right.
And as you can imagine, on those narrow park roads at that time, that was probably, not a good thing for the tourists in the mining trucks to meet.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you.
You bet.
That other person just kind of also mentioned just how wild it is to think about how isolated those Beartooth Gateway communities were prior to the construction of the highway. Okay. And I don't see John.
Here's another question. So why was the original black-white route abandoned? Oh, did we lose John?
Yeah, it looks like he might have disconnected for a minute. Hopefully he'll rejoin.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'll try to contact him and see what's going on.
Okay. Let's see if there's other comments. Lots of great comments. Hopefully John will be able to join us, but go ahead and continue to put your Qs and questions in the Q&A, and we'll get them to John, and hopefully he can answer them during the presentation, but if not, perhaps he can do a little follow-up. It's nice to see the comments from all of you who have memories of the Beartooth Highway, and comments about, someone just mentioned the See 'em Alive Zoo building. It's currently empty and for sale, and it used to house the Juniper Furniture Store. So that's an answer. Of course, people are commenting about the great photographs that were shared. Yeah. Hopefully John will be able to rejoin. I'm sure we all have our memories of the Beartooth Highway and driving over, and the thought of those guardrails not being up, and the tendency of people to kind of curve to the inside is pretty scary when you think about it.
John did mention that he is trying to reconnect, so I hope that you'll stay with us so that we can get some more answers from John. One thing that I did neglect to mention, he did write the book. He wrote the book, The Beartooth Highway, A History of America's Most Beautiful Drive, so the same title as this program. And the book is available in our gift shop at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum, and also available if you don't live in our local area, we could certainly mail that to you as well. So.
Great.
If any of you have stories about the Beartooth Highway, just type them in, and Diane and I will share them until John can reconnect.
So someone asks, does anyone know where the airport cafe shown in the first picture was? Where was that? Does anybody in the group here remember where the airport cafe was? Karen, you want to talk about the photo archives at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum, and what does the museum have on the Beartooth Highway? Is there much?
Well, that's a good question. I would imagine we have some photos, like especially in tourist photo albums or Yellowstone National Park employee photographs. I'm not aware of any construction photos, but we might have some.
Looks like John is back. Someone mentioned the wildflowers in the spring up there are fantastic. The great thing about going up the Beartooth Highway is if you miss the wildflowers at a lower elevation, earlier, in the year, you can just kind of move on up the highway and catch them again as the climate gets cooler. So it's a great opportunity to revisit those spring wildflowers over the course of the summer. Well, John's back. Great.
I'm back. Sorry about that. It's the second time I've been kicked off of this thing today. So I think it decided it needed updates right now.
Oh, okay. Somebody asks you where you got all those great photographs, John.
Some of them came from Flash's Photography in Red Lodge, which I think is closed now. I think their photos went to the Carbon County Historical Society, and a lot of them came from the Bureau of Public Roads reports that they made to that Mr. Mitchell made to his superiors in Washington, D.C. So most of that stuff involves McNutt and Pyle because they were so far behind schedule. And Mr. McNutt didn't get along with Mitchell and kept arguing with him and making wild claims about how far they could get when they didn't make that, when they couldn't do it. And all, glowing reports about how good Morrison Knudsen was doing. So that's where those photographs came from.
Wow.
So I'm not sure where they are now. They may be in Red Lodge as well.
We've got a couple of stories that people have been sharing as well. Here's one. She says, we were snowed in back in 1988 in Cooke City at about 3 in the afternoon. The sheriffs guided us out via 296, which was dirt back then in 1988. So that's interesting. I'm sure there have been a lot of people who've been snowed in Cooke City. Personally, that's kind of a dream of mine. I'd love to be snowed in Cooke City.
And she retracted, said it was 92 when that happened.
Oh, she did. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
later.
man, that's not that long ago.
No, certainly.
No. Someone asks if any of the stores in Cooke City are original ones from way back.
I think that Cooke City store, the one in the old Falls front, I think that's original. But I think all those motels came after the completion of the Beartooth. And Silvergate was kind of a planned community, but it didn't really take off until the Beartooth Highway was completed either. So Cooke City, Silvergate, and Red Lodge owe an awful lot to that highway.
Mm-hmm. Here's a comment. Also, my husband worked on the road crew for Yellowstone National Park on the Beartooth for years. And he has a great story about digging out a guy who got stuck up there who was from Israel and had never seen snow before. He got stuck in a drift when they were closing the road. He tried to hand my husband a wad of bills to thank him, which he appropriately refused. The guy was scared to death.
Oh, I bet.
I'll bet he's still telling that story.
It's a good story.
Yeah.
Someone asks, why was the original black-white route abandoned, and was it for engineering or political reasons?
Well, it was a little bit of both. It was, 13 switchbacks up the side of a route like that isn't really all that, something that a lot of tourists are going to want to do, or anybody just, casually driving that route either. And it appears to me that the whole reason why the project ended was because the Federal Aid Road Act in 1921 really was promoting highways that connected to each other, especially if it was interstate roads, or even if you look at maps of Montana highways or roads before 1921, a lot of them don't go anywhere, except maybe to other communities or to railroad stations or that type of thing. So what that particular legislation was trying to do was to build really intrastate roads. And but there was no plan to do anything with the black and white trail. Once it hit the top of the plateau, there was no plans to continue it on over the plateau into the Wyoming side of it. So there was really no connectivity with it And so when the 7% system was established, it was just figured that feds figured we're gonna spend our money on routes that be better served for the public. And the black and white trail just didn't do that. So maybe a little bit of politics. Of course, Siegfried wasn't very happy about it. He did get subscriptions from Red Lodge and Bear Creek businesses to continue the road on out over the top. But, Montana was plagued by a depression in the 1920s as well, and there just wasn't the money to keep that going, or really, it seems the will to do it.
And we have another question. Did General Sheridan's expedition have wagons going over the top?
That I don't know. I don't recall reading anything about it, but it seems to me that probably not. I would guess it was pack trains, because they were deep into the Beartooth Mountains, that the wagons really wouldn't have been very functional for them in 1881. So I'm guessing that probably didn't have wagons. There really was no road to follow.
Right. Thank you.
Here's a neat piece of history. The red building that houses the general store is original. Its interior is beautiful. Hemingway bought his fishing supplies there in the 30s and got his general delivery mail there.
Ah, now that's interesting.
Cool. Yeah, neat. Thank you for sharing.
Any other questions from our audience?
Just another related one, a story from the early 80s during a long backpack where my friend and I stayed for a night in a simple cabin in Cooke City. The owner said that she had taken Ernest Hemingway on trail rides up near the Index Mountain.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, there's two different references.
Yeah, that's
pretty
interesting.
neat. Yeah.
That is very cool. And then someone else asked, what's the story behind the ski run at the top?
I'm going to have to beg ignorance about that. I know they've been doing it for a long time, but I really don't know much about it other than I've seen them up there skiing. And I'm thinking that walk back up to the top of the hill must be a lot of fun. But I really don't know anything about it. I do know Princeton had a geology camp up there every year. That was also started by Dr. Siegfried. He was a real big amateur paleontologist and geologist. So that Princeton summer camp is still going on every year. It's been going on since the 20s, I believe.
Oh, that's very cool. That would be an interesting book too, John.
Yeah. Well, I think Dr. Siegfried would be at least worth an article, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, good idea. I did mention to folks while you were out that you had written a book of the same title as your presentation this evening. So hopefully people will pick up a book at the museum. I'm sure it's available in a lot of places.
Yeah.
Local bookstores, Amazon, etc. So
well, that was a fun one to write, that's for sure. Had a good time with it.
Great.
So.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I thank all of our viewers for watching this evening and for listening to the stories. We will be doing more speaker series probably this spring. So please watch your newspapers and social media for more information. Also keep in mind that all of our programs are uploaded on our YouTube channel, including this one. So if you know someone who missed the program this evening, please pass that information along. And thank you so much, John, for a wonderful program.
Great program.
All right, thank you. It was definitely my pleasure. And I got through the slides all right until the very end, and then something happened.
Well, that's all right. You handled it well, and thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.